in case you weren't here last month, my name's Ruth. I've been collaborating with Chris for a while. You probably know Chris since you probably follow him on Substack. Um, and we're here today to talk about a topic that we think is pretty relevant to what's going on in our country and also just work and life and all the things, which is how to collaborate with someone when you disagree about what the facts are. Um, yeah, so I'll share a little
Yeah.
bit from my end of kind of why this topic came up for me. I had a conversation recently with someone who I collaborate with uh, about race and racism in our country. I've been reading, well, I started reading this book honestly because of this conversation because I felt like
hmm
I didn't have a strong enough grasp of the facts to have an intelligent conversation the way I wanted to. But I was coming from the perspective that there are structures, not the perspective, but what I view as the facts, that there are structures in place that give advantage to people who have white skin and disadvantage to people who do not. And they did not have that view. And they literally said, I don't know of any structures that give me any kind of privilege because I'm white. And I was so flabbergasted, I had no idea how to continue in the conversation. And then they kept saying things that I had never heard and didn't agree with. And I kept asking, can you please tell me where you got that information from? I've never heard that. I would like to see your sources. And when they sent me their sources, it was like YouTube videos of like a 10-second clip of like an interview with somebody. Um, and every time I tried to make any of my points, I just felt like it was the most confusing conversation I've ever had. Like
Yeah.
we just went in circles. I didn't know how to interact. I was like, and I'm like, if we can't even agree on what is actually going on, then how do we collaborate at all about anything? So,
Yeah.
yeah.
I have a few
Um,
thoughts, initial
yeah,
thoughts. I thought, yeah, I could start with something. Well, I mean, okay, so maybe one distinction that's helpful is something like um, the distinction between like collaborating generally and kind of collaborating specifically. Something like, hey, are we working towards doing something? And then we have a disagreement about the facts as relevant to the specific thing that we're trying to get done,
okay.
right? Or is it more of a generally collaborative relationship, in which case you kind of care about the rapport that you have, the amount of trust that you have generally with the other person. And then, a debate crops up and that seems to affect something in the kind of the relational space. And then you're having difficulty trying to like navigate the facts of the situation. Do you know what I mean? So
Yeah.
the reason I think about that is because I think there can be a clearer, easier path in the kind of more specific or direct collaboration.
Right.
Sometimes, not always, right? Not always, but sometimes. Um, and yeah, gosh, I mean, it could go in so many different directions. I think what comes to my mind is partly, yeah, kind of like what's the goal of that conversation, right? Like, what are you looking for from the other person? My speculation is, putting myself in those same shoes. It's generally something in the area of, I would like to have them I would like to find some agreement or have agreement and be like, I mean, ideally, right? They're being like, yes, that I feel the same way too, because that's, I don't know, comfortable, more, it could be generative and kind of fun and whatever. Um, but if it becomes kind of more of like a debate kind of energy, right? Then, and that sounds like kind of like what it was, that conversation was, right? Okay, yeah. And when I think about debate, a very specific kind of question comes to my mind, which might seem like a silly question, but I find it clarifying, which is like, is anybody else watching or like judging or arbitrating the successfulness of which side is going to win? And the answer is probably no. Like if you're in a debate team, right? There's an audience and maybe they do like applause, or there's a judge and you're in a court and you're debating, but there's like an arbiter that's going to render judgment based on the arguments, in which case, each party that tends to work best if each party kind of focuses purely on their side and their points, and they do their best to make their points and their best to kind of break down the other side's points. So that's like, I would say, a good use of debate. Another use of debate potentially is like if you agree to debate, like between two, like, hey, we have a difference. Can we
Right.
debate this for a little bit, or can I try to change your opinion and whatever? Okay, so if there's not a third party or someone else kind of watching, then it's more obvious that it's the judge here is the two of you that are involved,
Right.
right? So it's like you know, then I go back to like, so what do I want out of that? What's my goal? If we're not going to get like a score after this, it's just a matter of like, does the other person kind of agree or just, what is it that I'm looking for? A lot of these things, when they get really heated or like spicy on these topics, I mean, I love having those kinds of conversations. I find them enjoyable, but I have the same
Usually I
experience.
do too. That's what was so crazy making about this conversation. I was like, yeah, sorry, go ahead. I was
Well, yeah. And then some of that's just like, do I want to keep having that kind of conversation? You know? Um, and then I have another thing that kind of, the way my brain works, it was like three or four different, almost like distinct threads that I'm sure somehow relate to each other, but they're almost like distinct responses to like the original situation. Can I give you another one?
yeah, good.
Another way to approach the question is something like, well, there are kind of different um, criteria for what counts as truth or what counts as a fact. So, it may be the case that even if both parties are looking for the facts, you might have, different standards here of what kind of counts as the facts. So, we could use like a constructive developmental lens here of like different ways of making meaning, Jean Piaget with kids and object permanence and concrete operational, these different stages that children go through and how they make meaning of reality, right? Falls along these kind of broad stage patterns. And then since that time, a lot of people have done a lot of work more on the later stages, adult stages, to kind of show, hey, cross culturally, even if we kind of divide them up and cut the lines slightly differently, there does seem to be some predictable patterns of how kind of people make meaning as they go through their lives. Some 4, 5, 6 stages, some 4, whatever, 4 broad. Yeah, like again, these are still pretty broad bands, but the reason I think of that is because if you think of, and we'll just say for the anyone watching, that doesn't know that stuff. Let's just say, what can we say? Like pre-conventional, conventional, and post-conventional. Conventional, just kind of being like socialized mind. What we try to help teenagers be like: get along with others, respect others, be fair, take turns. You want kind of an integration of your own needs with understanding that other people also have needs, and we have to try to kind of find some way of working together. This is kind of like the foundation of civil society. It exists in this kind of conventional mind, and pre-conventional is kind of before that, a little bit more on the selfish side. You might think of like the terrible twos, like it's just kind of me, or like I just, no one's going to tell me what to do, just resistance for someone telling me anything to do. And then the post-conventional kind of being able to have a more evolved version of understanding how you can kind of have your own kind of boundaries and principles and autonomy. And that in doing so, it's kind of like a move back into more kind of individuation, right? I'm kind of moving back out of the conventional where we're all just kind of one big group. Now I'm kind of getting back in touch with my individuality, but I have kind of more sophisticated ways of understanding how I can connect with others. The reason I mention all of that is to say, at the like pre-conventional kind of phases, a lot of what counts as truth often kind of comes from authority or what that individual considers to be an authority. If you just, think of like a student in a classroom, kind of like what is true is like what the teacher tells them or what the worksheet that the teacher handed out. It's like that seems true to me because the source from which it's coming is a credible source in my mind, right? And just kids relying on their parents. So it's a lot about like the sources of authority tend to be very intimately connected to like what counts as truth. Okay, conventional now is a lot more on kind of the rational mind, right? Logical mind, like what makes sense, what could I argue? Either it's like empirical facts or logical facts, right? Things I could kind of measure and show and demonstrate. That kind of is, so if you end up, let's just say, in those two kind of broad stroke stages, and someone trying to find and argue facts based on here's empirical evidence, or here was a study that was done, or here's whatever. And then the other party um, is operating more kind of a pre-conventional level on that topic or in that domain, right? Where they're pointing more towards kind of like blah, 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 blah. Yeah, that all sounds like you're trying to make a sophisticated, confusing argument to try to confuse me. You know, this is what Trump said or whatever, right? And I trust, or whomever, right? This is what my dad said, or this is what this source that I trust said. And so that's to me enough to count as truth. Whereas, right, conventional is going to say, well, no, I need more. And post conventional might go beyond that and say, well, there's kind of like different ways of looking at truth can be a little bit more relative, right? We can look at within a specific context what's going to count as truth, right? And we can kind of evaluate it that way. But these different ways of trying to assess and evaluate truth, both in terms of stages or in terms of like perspectives, we've talked a little bit about. Ken Wilber, you and I, but not that much, right? Like integral theory, Ruth, and stuff. So like he has a model of like these different quadrants, which I won't just jump into, but that's another way of looking at it. Like, the I, we, and it's, the true, the good, and the beautiful, right? These are like fundamentally different perspectives or ways of evaluating truth. They have different validity claims and criteria that you need to reach to determine what is truth.
Can I jump in?
Yeah, go ahead.
So what do you do when like what I'm gathering from this conversation is I was coming from the more conventional mindset probably, and this person was coming from more the pre-conventional mindset, and I feel like that's a lot of what's going on in the country.
Mm.
And then how the hell do you have a conversation, and how do you bridge that in conversation when one person will take like my neighbor who I trust says blah 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 and therefore it's true, and I'm like, here's statistics that prove that the opposite of what you're saying is true. Like I don't I this is what why this conversation was okay, this is helpful because now I can see like this is what was driving me crazy, and I didn't know how to navigate it, and I like mostly just gave up, and they talked almost the whole conversation, and every time I tried it went nowhere, and I got really frustrated, and it seemed like they felt like the conversation was resolved at the end, and I was left extremely frustrated and annoyed and like kind of despairing. And so
right. I mean, all of that description just does sound to me of like different assumptions at play, right? Like you're saying something, but there's like implicit assumptions or a framework or a mental model, right? And the other person is coming from a different one. And so you're kind of talking past each other, or you're talking for whatever. And so, that's what's going to happen. And then if the question is like, well, how do you not do that? Well, the only things that I know that you can do are try to call out what those assumptions are, what those frames of reference are. Although I tend to think, again, primarily about like, what's my purpose here? Right? Like, what do I need? Do I need them to agree? Or do I need them to understand? And those are two different things, although they're often conflated. Or you don't necessarily even need them to fully understand. You just want to feel like they're making some space for you to express your opinion, and there's some receptivity. In which case, if it was that, right, that's something you can ask for. I mean, you don't want to, yes, you ask for it, but you don't ask for it directly like that. At least I've never found any success of saying, hey, could you, I don't know, abstractly make me feel like you are receptive to what I'm saying. But what you need to do is ask them to repeat back, what they think you're saying, right? And so I would set it up like this. This is one of my favorite like moves. I mean, it's like talk about like a life skill. This is applicable in so many areas, but here it is again. Something like, "Hey, could I get like a minute or 2 minutes, and then I'll give you like a minute or 2 minutes. In fact, maybe even you can start, and I'll let you go first. But I'll set a timer, and like you'll have 2 minutes, and just explain to me your side of things, and I'll just listen. And at the end of those 2 minutes, I'll just reflect back what I think I'm getting, what I'm hearing, but I'm going to be totally focused on just getting your perspective. I'm going to, I'll have my time later. And then you can, correct anything I missed, add anything that I missed, or correct anything I got wrong. Right. Um, and we can do that. So I'll do 2 minutes of that. Right. And then we'll switch. Right. And then you'll just have 2 minutes just to try to listen and reflect back. Like, are you up for doing that?
That's a
with
great
the
idea.
with the soul, like, yeah, having them be like, no, or yeah, that's fine. This is what I would say is kind of more typical. If you were to say all of that, they would say, uh, yeah, that's fine. I think what I'm just trying to say, and they just go right back into it, right? Like they're almost like they're still hearing like a political move or a rhetorical move on your part, right? They're not like actually really processing it as a request. So in my experience, you say that, they might say something like that. Yeah, yeah, that's fine. And then they just keep going on with their point because they're basically still kind of processing their thoughts, but just out loud. In which case, kind of nods like, cool, cool. Well, okay. So do you want to start now? Is what I might say. Interrupt them and say, well, let's just, okay. So you just want to keep going, right? Can we do the 2 minutes thing? Make it very clear. We're yes, no, 5 minutes, 1 minute, whatever. Cool. Get their agreement to do that and get their agreement to try to reflect it back to you. Like that's a way to dramatically increase the likelihood that you're going to feel like the other person at least heard you, right? They might not agree. They might not even fully understand, right? Their reflection might be piss poor, but you also have a chance to try to correct, right? And
Right.
do all that. And then that's at least a way to kind of increase your chances of getting that done.
I like that. That would be very helpful because how the conversation went was mostly them talking, and I would try and they would talk for so long
Oh,
and make, like, 5 different points, and then I couldn't respond to by the time they were done, I'm like, "I've lost what I was gonna even respond to because you said so many things that I have opinions about that I'm like, I can't even remember them all." And then I would start to respond to one of them, and then they would start talking
yeah.
again, and I'm like, "Oh my god, I just, like, can't."
Well, not
Like,
yeah. That totally makes sense. I mean, it makes sense. It's extraordinarily frustrating. But when you were starting to describe it, I was like, oh right. If I put myself in your shoes, this it sounds a bit. You can tell me if this is correct in the for you in this situation, but it's like a way that I tend to operate, which is something like I am going to give you space, so you're talking blah 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 blah, right? But my assumption is you're also giving me space, right? Like that's like one of the assumption level things. It's like, oh, the way we're going to navigate this conversation is you're just going to talk. Yeah, well, I mean, I don't agree, but I'm going to make space for you. But then that comes with this implicit assumption that they're also going to make space for me, which they might not at all be interested in, right? In their mind, this is like, let's just battle it out and talk over each other. And that, I don't know, that's what they want to do. So that's where I get into like, it's kind of like, what are the ground rules? What's the purpose? What are we really trying to go for here? I would say at the top, you have something like agreement. And that's a bit, that's great when it happens, but that can be a bit bold, right? Especially if you already sense you're coming from such two different places. But underneath that agreement, I put understanding, right? I just want you to understand what I'm
right.
saying, even if you don't agree with it, right? That's like a different level. And then maybe underneath understanding is again, like just at least trying, right? Some receptivity. Still not, might not have understood, certainly didn't get to agreement. But if you're going to go down that ladder, right, then you give yourself a much better chance of getting your need met.
Part of what okay, this is helpful. So part of what was driving me crazy in that conversation was this is someone who, if you ask them, they would say that they think they listen
Yeah.
and that they value hearing the other perspective. And so part of I think what's missing is a total lack of self-awareness when that's not happening.
Mhm.
So Like, even if they agreed, like, we're gonna take time back. So the idea of, like, actually setting a timer, like, it feels like there has to be some kind of more clear structure to ensure that actually happens
Yeah.
because I hardly talked at all. I mean, we recorded this conversation because we were doing it very intentionally to, like, have to talk out a thing we disagreed
Understood.
about, and I haven't gone back to listen to it yet because I was so frustrated I didn't really wanna relive it, but I'm kinda curious to be like, "Let me track the, like, amount of time because my perception of how much I talked, I'm curious if it actually lines up with what actually happened, but it felt like I hardly talked, and
Yeah.
and it felt like I was getting hit with a fire hose, like, it was just, like, so much information and so many opinions, and it was yeah, and then every
Yep.
time I tried, like, I asked I can't even tell you how many times I said, "Okay, I would really like to know your source. Like, where did you hear that information? Like, where did you learn it? I've never heard that before. I'm curious where you heard that." And it was like I didn't even ask that question, like, it just kinda got, like, brushed over. I'm like, "Can we be
Well,
sorted?"
I mean, probably because again, that the person is also not particularly like if I'm in their shoes, I'm thinking of that question as like a bit of a challenge to the credibility of what I'm saying, right? Like technically you're just asking for the source, but given the context of saying, "Hey, can you give me a source?" Right? It's like challenging the thing that I'm saying, right? And so you're
Right.
still trying to battle it rhetorically.
Well, and I was wondering okay, so here's a question about that specifically is I was aware that I was challenged because I was internally like, "What
Totally.
is this bullshit? Like, where did you" but then I also was, like, really trying to be like, "Okay, I'm asking you to be willing to change how you think, and I'm, like, super not willing to change how I'm thinking right now 'cause my perspective is I'm right, you're wrong,"
Yeah.
and which is not a helpful way to have dialogue, so I was also trying to be like, "Maybe I'm missing some facts," and I'm, like, genuinely also wanting to know, "Where did you learn that? Maybe there's some parts of this story that I don't know." And then to, like, be met with, like so I don't know how to ask the question from that perspective. Like, if I'm open, at least part of me is open to the perspective that I don't have the whole view. Like, well, now that I
Oh,
say that, I'm
right.
like, "Of course I don't have the whole view." I don't have the whole view. So go ahead.
Well, here's one interesting. I don't know. This is something that I've actually. I don't know if I've actually had to use it, but here's a heuristic, like a little rule of thumb that might be helpful in that kind of situation. So if they're giving you a bunch of that stuff, you're trying to kind of what be receptive to it or listen and question your own assumptions. Like maybe I'm wrong about this kind of stuff. This kind of goes back to a philosopher, Karl Popper, who really did a lot with kind of like the scientific method and thinking about kind of how epistemology and how knowledge works. But the point that he makes that I wanted to share was something like in order for it to be kind of considered a credible claim, and I mean scientific here in like capital S, like just a way of gaining knowledge, not necessarily just like physical sciences, but um, the claim must be falsifiable. In other words, there must be the possibility of finding some evidence, not saying that the evidence is existing, right? Because the claim may be 100% true, but there at least must be some possibility that if we gathered more data, it would kind of disconfirm that hypothesis. The thing that you're claiming is falsifiable. So again, we could use examples, the ones that I think of. Again, I haven't actually had to use this on anybody, I don't think, or use it in terms of like sharing it and saying this is what I'm looking for. But if you've got like a flat earther, right, or something, and it's like, yeah, this is the way it is, you can listen to all of their evidence, right? But I think the key question is what kind of evidence for you, flat earther, would make you reconsider your position. And if they can't give you any, right, then I think you're in actually a good position to kind of dismiss the opinion, right? Dismiss the claim. Like, okay, I mean,
Huh.
you're not really okay. So you're kind of doing a thing, but you're not really interested in kind of actually knowing what would actually be true. You're just kind of you have this strong opinion about it. Is that right? Like you can pivot from that, but I do think there's some at least latent power in the falsifiability area, right? And this again is particularly, I think, of like conspiracy theorists who no amount of evidence is ever going to convince them.
That's such a great question. Because even if you ask me that question about my views about race, I feel like my instinctive response is, well, if every Black person I talk to told me that this is not their experience and that they feel fine and they don't feel oppressed at all, then I would be like, okay, well, maybe I'm totally wrong about this. Like,
Right. Yeah. Right. I mean, to pull that thread, right? It may be for them. I don't know, right? You could even, if what would be a disconfirming piece of evidence in support of your side of things that would challenge theirs, right? Like, what was theirs? Like, there's no white privilege or something
yeah,
like.
there's no structures in place that give white people any kind of benefit or privilege.
Yeah, I mean, again, you have to ask them, like, what evidence would you need to see, right? And again, you can. It's better if it's not coming with a challenging
Yeah,
energy, right?
energy,
But
totally.
but more curious, but it could be a bit mixed. And say, like, what evidence might you need to see, right? Because again, it gets back to, like, it's not, you don't kind of really expect them necessarily to generate. Oh, this is what I would need to say or see, though they may. It's more around trying to reestablish, like, what are we talking about here? Like, what are we doing? I'm kind of doing this fact finding mission, right? And trying to, like, gauge the validity of these different claims. And so I'm looking at certain kinds of evidence, and I'd like to see kind of your kinds of evidence, right? But um, if if ultimately, right, your authority, the credibility that you're using to kind of make those claims is based on air or stuff that I don't consider credible, right? Then okay, well, then I know that. I don't know. Like, we might not have a an overlap. There might not be a way for us to come to agreement. But at least then you kind of know what you're dealing with. I think about the Piaget thing too in the constructive developmental lens, um, partly because it highlights how almost insurmountable some of those differences can be, right? Where, like, I use, like, the example of, like, a tennis ball, right? With, like, one half is colored green and one half is red, right? And you can, like, show a 2-year-old or whatever, like, show them that it's got two colors, and you can show them the red side, which means the green is facing and you can say, like, what side, or three. I'm not good with, I don't know the ages, the appropriate developmental ages for these things. Um, what side am I seeing? Right? They're seeing the red, you're seeing the green, and they will say red because they do not yet have the capacity to take your perspective, to put themselves in your shoes. And in a way, again, this is a reality that you experience that they do not experience. It is not like they really know it and they're pretending that they don't to just piss you off, right? It's like the thing that you may be talking about, systemic racism, might not be a thing in their reality that they can even kind of see or comprehend as a thing. So you can talk about it all you want to, but they don't even, not necessarily even the specific case, they don't know the category of thing. So that, I think, reorients or puts you into a more humbling or more realistic kind of perspective. This is not to say that this is actually the case, right? This is just to kind of highlight the potential of these kinds of things. Like, we could be so far off that the thing that feels very powerful and true to me, and is actually often the case that this happens when you're feeling like things are really powerfully and true, because to you it feels like an important, almost like, discovery that you've made, right? You can kind of recall a time in your life before you had this discovery,
Mhm.
and now you have the discovery, and it's been so eye opening and so helpful, right? And you've got, like, this is great, and then the other person doesn't see it, right? Like, by definition, they're just kind of not seeing that thing. So you have a big gap to overcome.
So what do you okay, so this makes sense, and I have an initial instinctive react like resistance to this
Yeah.
potential reality
Good.
that we just see on such different ways of operating and viewing the world that we can't actually. So here's my question: is in the 3-year-old example with the tennis ball, no one's getting hurt. So like if the 3-year-old's inability to see anything from your perspective means like your bones are being broken or like your life is in danger, then it feels like a much more
Yeah.
urgent
Then fuck
situation.
that. Yeah. Then do what you need to do.
So, but then what do we do as a country
Well,
when
I would
we're
say,
like
yeah,
people are
just
literally like being killed because of people's inability to like put themselves in someone else's shoes, and that so it feels like this that's part of the charge I have in these conversations is like, it feels urgent that we become aware of what's actually going on. And like, part of me just wants to be like, put on your big person panties. Like, you gotta like, I just got them. Getting at the mom.
Yeah, I'm trying. I'm getting a text, even though I put this on like do not disturb. So I was trying to turn it off, or turn on. Make sure it's on do not disturb. Okay, keep going.
Hi, Michelle. Hi, Michelle. We're still getting it. Though. Something changed in the app.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, maybe it was just because it just came through on my computer, but I don't know how to do that. I know.
Are you hearing me?
Yeah, yours sounds very echoey.
What do you want?
What if I do what?
Mute. Let's see, did that work? Haha, perfect. Okay, cool. That's odd. I wonder what happened. Okay, so what were they saying? Oh, if there's like actual harm being caused by people's inability to look at and someone else's perspective and have any kind of like perspective or empathy, which I could argue that like that individual isn't necessarily causing like, I mean, probably in their day-to-day life they're causing micro harms to people without even being aware of it. But like, this is where I get kind of lost and judgmental and frustrated and impatient with people where I'm like, you have to wake up to what's going on. Like, if you don't wake up, like people are literally dying. Like, it's not good. Um, and people that I'm immediately connected to are being impacted by people's lack of willingness to like have perspective. So then I don't know, like, and then that creates an urgency in me, which comes out of my conversation because then I feel this urgent need to like, you have to understand what I'm saying, which of course does not make conversations effective. But I don't know how to navigate this. Like, it's striking. I mean, you might while you talk. Muted, Chris.
Yeah, I was just going to test just to see if it was going to do the same thing on your end.
Nope.
Okay. Right. Well, yeah. I mean, now, yeah. There's concern on your end. There's something at stake. That whole little thread about the developmental stuff, I think is maybe just better said as something like, just be aware of when you're, kind of banging your head against a wall and expecting the wall to change. That's all, right? Like, the line has to be somewhere of like, oh, right, this is just not, a fruitful area for me. This is not the time or the place or the person or the topic to make an inroad. Right. So, in a way, you could potentially frame it as like, maybe even in that moment, you're using that occasion. It triggers things you want to share. You would love to just shake them awake. Right. As would I. The reality, though, is, as you said, that doesn't tend to work actually too well. There are stances, there are energies that tend to work better, but I certainly do not begrudge like a passionate frustration of just like, F off. But at least for me, that's a pivot of the energy, right? Instead of like trying to really make sure that they get it, it's like, well, then I just would pivot to like doing something else to help on that issue and maybe revisit it. It's like the dynamics of the interaction you have that's its own little thing. It may be connected to a broader issue and broader things you care about or trying to do in your life more broadly. But that specific interaction with that specific individual is its own little microcosm of a thing. And if it's just not working and it's clear to you that it's not working and you continue to press and it continues to not work, it's kind of like, okay, so maybe the lesson there is, have some other ways of setting it up, right? I mentioned like, hey, would you be up for this? Like a 2-minute thing, or you try to, try that. So you could do some of those things, or just recognize like, oh yeah, this is not going to be at least today, right? Maybe they go and think about it and then they revisit it. and you come back and, oh yeah,
It's a very inconvenient tech issue. Michelle, I just wanted to read what you said. I can hear your intense concern and urgency. This happens to me too. Nervous system starts to go offline. 100%. Totally. So, okay. So this is reminding me of a different dynamic that I had a similar level of, well, maybe, but I also had a reactive response that I've already told you, Chris, but I'll tell everyone else. So, this is more specific too, because you were at the beginning drawing this distinction between like people you're generally trying to collaborate with as an energy, but not around a specific thing, versus like you have a very specific thing you're collaborating on and you disagree about the facts. So I work with somebody. I work part time in a French bakery, and uh, I have a coworker who has vague frustrations with me that they've never like specifically really voiced exactly what they are, and just has this general complaining attitude and complains about everybody all the time to everybody. Um, and has complained to my face like once, and I was so surprised and like floored by what they said that I just left because I like didn't know how to respond. And then fast forward like a couple weeks, I finally got over my ego and realized there was a couple things I knew they were frustrated about that I hadn't been doing because I was so mad about how they were approaching the conversation that I was like, you know what, just get over yourself and do the things. So I had been doing the things that the things that I knew that they wanted me to do. And on the day that I was doing all the things that they were frustrated about, they were still giving me attitude. And at the end of the day, they walked by me kind of muttering under their breath about something they were frustrated about. And I literally turned around and was like, do you have a problem? And they were like, yes. And I was like, what's your problem? And it was not at all proud of how I handled this. Like I was super defensive. I was very frustrated. And they were like, you don't do blah, 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 whatever the things were. And I was like, I have literally done all of those things today. Like, I do not know what you're talking about. And then they just kept going off. And this is another area where like we disagree about the facts. I'm like, I know what I did today. You don't know what I did because you were in the back room. Like you're not even around to see what I'm doing. I know I did those things. You're mad at me for not doing things that I actually did. And that was like the extent of our like our conversation. It was like I just basically yelled at them and was like, I did those things. And then they were like, no, you didn't do this. I'm like, yes, I did. And then we never talked about it again. And they've been super nice to me ever since. I don't know if they've been nice about me behind my back because they talk about everyone behind everyone's back. But you and I had talked about, and I was talking to someone else about this too, about how sometimes some people's energy, you have to meet them with the level of energy that they have. And they're very blunt and very direct, this coworker. Well, sort of, because they complain behind people's backs, but like they say what they mean and they don't hold it in. And I definitely hold stuff in as a default. And so I was like, holy crap, was that effective? Like, that was not at all how I want to show up in conversations. Like, it went against all my own values about how I want to be in and yet it seems to have changed the dynamic. Hang on, I'm going to read what Marcus said. I have a friend who is into conspiracy. I focus on the relationship and trying to listen to his pain. Oh, nice. Which is behind this. Instead of trying to convince him with words, I try to show my attitude. What I try demonstrating, understanding. Oh, ugh. I have so many reactions to that. That's beautiful. And instantly my ego is like, but I want to be right. Like that. So there's that. Like clearly I have some ego wrapped up in, um, that's humbling.
Can I share something on this too?
Yeah.
I mean, I love the story of the coworker and kind of like the overreaction that you're not proud of, and yet seemingly it seems to have had some effect in changing the dynamic and kind of improving it, or at least changing it, something like that. And I think that's an important thread of this too. Again, it's like I'm not a big believer. I mean, I'm a believer in kind of the 200% responsibility. Like I'm going to be responsible for my reactions, and I'm responsible for what I say, and I'm responsible for what I hear. Right? I'm fully responsible all the time. And I think it works best when the other party is also fully responsible all the time. With that said, right, like that needs to also include the possibility of having a bad day and just being a human being. And so the standard isn't that, I'm always going to be that. I may aspire to that. And so, like, it gets back to like, yeah, so I don't know, like if the person frustrates you and it ends up being a not a pleasant experience, then it's like, well, then what do you want to get out of it, right? You have the options of approaching it differently. You can do them, and if that helps, great. If it ends up being kind of an argument, but somehow that also feels like helpful, I've had that. I've had arguments that weren't comfortable, but still in some ways felt helpful and generative and moved the conversation forward. So the element of like not being so carefully managed and orchestrated, I think is important, right? And just being able to give yourself the freedom to also just be who you are. And sometimes the exact right response is just waiting there underneath, the kind of manager, super ego in charge that's trying to make sure you're doing everything right, or the different patterns that we have. So there's that. What was the comment that came in earlier that you were referencing?
Sorry, what was
Oh, yeah.
About his some conspiracy theories, and he tries to focus on the relationship and always he's pain. Also, he says, I have the idea that showing, not telling, is more effective. It's not easy, by the way. Thank you for that, Marco, because it doesn't feel easy. And showing not telling really does resonate, and also, my ego is so like, "Argh." And also, I just want to respond real quick before I know the whole mute thing is annoying. That what you're saying about like also giving myself permission to just be myself, like that's part of what isn't happening, is like I'm trying to say the right thing, or I'm trying to be like thoughtful and listening, and so then I like censor myself, which is part of my frustration in these conversations, I think, because what I didn't say in that conversation, the other conversation where I was like, oh my God, like was what I was actually feeling, which is like, hey, I'm feeling like you're not listening to me, and I'm feeling really frustrated. And like, I never said what was actually going on for me. I just like stewed internally and got resentful and frustrated, which is not effective. Yeah. So anyway, okay, I'm muting myself.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that was well said. The other bit that I wanted to add. Oh, one of the things that I have used a lot that I really like, it's like making the distinction of like, if you are trying to change someone's mind on something, if you're clear that that's what you want to do, you would not believe the power that comes to you and comes to the interaction if you just lean into that. It kind of reminds me again back to the like super ego manager trying to orchestrate and be, trying to handle everything and be fully responsible for the interaction. What often ends up happening is you have like the agenda that you really have is kind of like under the surface, and it kind of leaks out, and the other person kind of knows. And so the thing that they may be reacting to is this weird like incongruity of like, you're kind of trying to make it seem like you're really open to hearing my perspective, but at the same time, you're kind of saying that like, if I don't do this, I'm basically like, clubbing baby seals. So, it's going to be difficult for them to know how to respond. Okay. So the alternative is something like, well, I feel very differently about this topic, or I feel like it's really important, this and this. Can I get consent to the context, right? Get their consent to the context. Can I try to convince you or try to sell you on or try to change your opinion on that? Blah, 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 right? Or I want to, right? What I want to do is try to change your opinion. I want to convince you of blah, 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 blah. You would not believe the power of just putting that on the table. And it's been, in hindsight now, so shocking to me of how we often avoid it. But it's like we think we're being clever. It's the same thing that some of the same dynamics that happen with feedback, right? Where we're like, well, I don't want to kind of call it feedback. I don't want to make it seem like that triggers things. So what I'd rather do is just kind of try to work it in a normal conversation, these critiques of, who they are and how they behave. I just like to work those in a nice casual conversation. Yeah, that will go much better, right? Versus just being like, oh, I don't know, have the conversation and then like, oh, I want to do a thing. Feedback. Are you open for? They can say no, right? But get their consent to that, and then same thing. Like, are you basically trying to get their consent to the receptivity, right? Like, are you going to be open to changing your mind on this or hearing my side on it? And no is a fine answer, right? Because I don't want a fake no. I don't want a fake yes, right? I'd much rather a real no. And then they may say, I mean, again, if it happens after you've already been debating for 30 minutes, the likelihood of success goes down. But if it happens early, right, they may be like, yeah, sure. Right. At least that's an opening coming from the inside out, right? Versus the thing that we often try to do is like, oh, if I just press and push, that will somehow open them up, which of course it has the opposite effect, right? It just tends to make people want to put up the barriers because they feel that pressure, they feel the incongruity. And so that's destabilizing. All of that mess gets in the way. But if you just lean into it, this is what I would like to do. Amazing.
Love this because um, there's something you said earlier that I feel like paired. I just lost it. Hang on, the muting thing threw me off. Uh, oh, what was it? Pairing with, I was thinking of something you said earlier. Oh, I feel like asking for consent to change someone's mind paired with the question of like, what would it take for you to consider changing your mind could be interesting because then I could be like, okay, great. Then I could steer my conversation from that perspective of like, because part of what happened in that conversation with that other friend is they literally said at some point, I thought the point of this was we weren't trying to change each other's minds. And I was like, oh, 100%. I've been trying to like I came into this conversation with the intention to change your mind. Like we were on different pages from the beginning, um, because I disagree with your perspective and I think it's harmful. And so I wasn't here to just listen. Like I wanted to understand why you have that perspective, but I also wanted to change your mind. Like it wasn't just I just want to listen. And so that was a fundamental mismatch um, from the beginning. So this is great. I want to read what let's see. So Michelle said, as Viktor Frankl wrote, the pause between stimulus and response is where the power lies. Oh my God. I I feel like there is no pause sometimes between stimulus and response. In me, I'm aware that there actually is, but like it depends on the moment, but sometimes I have more of a pause and sometimes less, and 100% that's where the power lies, and it's often a very small pause. Um, also like what Marco said, what sometimes works for me is the phrase, part of me this, part of me that. I had a therapist who suggested that years and years and years ago. And just for myself to be like, part of me doesn't want to get out of bed today is like a very helpful reminder that that's like not all of me, but I don't use that very often. It reminds me actually of Chris had a video about feedback that talked a little bit about that, about owning your experience, saying like, from my perspective, this, which feels like another angle of that, but slightly different because it also is like acknowledging it's not even all of me that thinks that. It's just like a part of me that, which opens you up more to hearing, which I like. The practice is to take the pause. Yes. My ego also has issues with that. I also heard this great practice tip. I'd like to pitch you an idea. Yes, Chris basically said this is those typing. Yeah, I've experienced this with my sibling too, where we've had conversations that were going really, really badly. And then we were like, well, it's going so badly that we might as well be honest now. And then we were like brutally honest with each other. And then we talked for like 3 hours. And both of us at some point in this conversation were like, well, that's the end of our relationship. And then by the end of it, it was so resolved that we don't even remember what we were talking about. Like none of it, like, and both of us were like, what the fuck? Like that was crazy. Sorry, I should never asked about swearing. Sorry if that was, but it was wild how like resolved it is when you actually say all. But then I've had other relationships where I say all the things there are to say and the other person doesn't, and that does not work. Like both people have to actually say all the things, which, and I'm not reliable to say everything that's on my mind. But what you were saying, Chris, about just kind of saying what there is, like, hey, I want to change your mind. How are you open to that? I've literally never said that to anyone. And now I kind of want to try. Like,
Yeah, I would just say like that because even if for a lot of people, even if that's not the primary, as in this case, which is like you said, like that is like it was obvious to you that you felt that. It is often mixed with a bit of like openness to like being wrong or hearing the other person's side of it. But again, it gets back to like that tends to show up in the realm of like the presuppositions or the assumptions of like, okay, so we're both going to hear the way this is going to work is I give you some space, I kind of nod along and show you that and then I expect you to do the same thing, right? That's where, if that becomes problematic, just being more explicit about those things, like what is it exactly you want from them, to change their mind, to give you space, you know, you can ask for those things. That tends to be a lot cleaner. And there are even some. Um, so Terry Real is a relational therapist guy. I like his work in general. There's a quote that comes to my mind that I actually have a lot of problems with, I mean, there's a seed of truth in it, but it's something like this: objective reality has no place in personal relationships. Now, I even saying it, I'm like, there's so much like rhetorical flourish on that it's borderline to me untrue. But the point again, he's trying to make a point of emphasis, but instead of making that elegantly, he goes for like the chainsaw versus the scalpel. But fine, okay. So, but the point is, like in a interpersonal conversation, right? The reality of the thing is that conversation, right? It gets back to like these different criterion for truth. Like if we're doing a science experiment and we're being able to see measurable results, well, that's one kind of truth, right? Trying to figure out what's true for me is another kind of truth. But when you're in a kind of intersubjective space and you're making meaning together, right? The truth is essentially kind of contained within that interaction. So what often happens is we bring our own agenda. Maybe it's I'm still trying to work out my own thinking. This is something like a pattern that I fall into. I often unconsciously will slip into kind of a debate energy, but almost like as an attempt to kind of challenge and evolve my thinking on something. Right? Because I kind of care a little bit more about getting to the truth than I care about the awkwardness, and kind of can even enjoy a little bit of the battle. So I may lay traps that get me into debates where that's not ultimately all that helpful. So the Terry Real point is when it comes to processing tensions, interpersonal tensions is really mostly where he's kind of bringing up that point. If you have an issue, um, you've got to deal with the facts of someone else's experience, basically, right? Like even if you didn't actually say that thing, but they believe that you did, you have to deal with the fact that they believe that you did. I would counter, and they need to deal with the fact that you don't think that you did, right? And that there are ways of kind of finding a third path where neither of you have to be wrong and neither of you have to be kind of complete enablers of all of our shadow patterns that, show up in our minds that make us believe certain things happened when they didn't. So I do think there is a place for objective reality. Absolutely. In personal relationships. But again, the sentiment of recognizing when that is taking priority and the other person isn't on board with that. Totally different if they're like, let's do that, or I'm up for that, right? Go for it. But if you are trying to kind of use a certain kind of criteria, a certain way of processing the exploration of truth that they're not thinking of, and in this case, starting full circle back to the example, right? They said, "Oh, I thought the conversation we were having was explicitly to not do that." So, right, you don't really need to go much further to imagine that, well, something's going to go wrong.
Yep, 100%. That's like it's funny. We get all through all of this, and then I'm like, that's probably the like main problem that was happening in that conversation was I went in with a full expectation of trying to change their mind, and they were thinking we were just there to listen to each other. Um, I mean, there was lots of elements. I'm sure it was not quite that simple, but like I'm sure that heavily tainted both of our experiences of that conversation. Which now makes me honestly kind of want to go back to this person and be like, "Can we have a conversation where I try to change your mind about this? Because I would actually really like to change your mind." And I have no idea if they would be open to it, but I honestly think they. Yeah, I know. I think that that's part of what I don't know. There's a TED Talk a long time ago, I forget her name, but a woman who was leaving the Westboro Baptist Church, or who left the Westboro Baptist Church, which are it's the Baptist church on the East Coast that, like, pickets outside gay pride parades and stuff there. Um, and she talks about her experience of what it took for her to be able to change her mind, and because she grew up in that church and was very, like, indoctrinated in that way of thinking, and she talks about, like, the strangers on the internet who basically changed her mind, and which now that I'm saying this, I'm like, I should go back and rewatch that because 'cause I'm like, how there was Steph, she, like, breaks it down, like, here are the 5 things they did that allowed me to be able to change my mind. Um, and what was my point? Oh, I feel like this is an important thing to happen in the world because I think people are still subscribing to beliefs that are causing harm to other people, and we're not open to changing our minds and/or we don't have the ability to engage with someone in a way that gives them the space to change their mind, then, I think that's a problem. Um, yeah, so, okay, I'm unmuting.
Yeah, I think that was well said. Maybe then one of the conclusions is we could like kind of tweak the framing. Maybe this might be a move in the wrong direction, but it's kind of like less about, or at least to me in my mind, it's less about like the facts. Like, what do you do when you disagree about the facts on something, and more like I would say dealing more with like beliefs, like something you feel kind of in your bones, not just like a opinion, right? But like a deep. It's at that level of assumption, right? Where you're often not even aware. It is subject. It is your perspective from which you see. It is not object. For most people, we all have them, right? But the thing that the belief is operating at that level, right? And so you're not even aware of it as a distinct thing that's informing. So, yeah, basically, it's like, how do you collaborate when you have different beliefs, right? Because again, it gets back to like you have a belief about truth. That's why that's important, and what truth means and how you get it. Someone else has a different belief about truth and how and all that stuff. So navigating the beliefs at play with people, I do think there are somewhat kind of more standard approaches depending on the type of relationship, depending on the interaction. But one tool that applies almost everywhere is, clarity of your intention and giving them the opportunity to kind of opt in to the kind of conversation that you want to have. This is why I think it's so fun and so cool about it is these things that we try to avoid, right? I don't want to have to like do the feedback thing or like try to tell them I want to change your mind because that feels like so intrusive. It's just so funny because it impacts the person in the complete opposite way, right? When you're clean and you're putting your agenda out there, right? The effect on the other person tends to be like, oh, phew, I don't have to worry about some sort of hidden agenda, right? They're just being straight up with me. And then I have the chance to say no. And so if they say yes, right, then now, right, they internally, right, are now as receptive at least as they can be. And that really should be the goal. I'll stop there because we're kind of close to time.
So I'm kind of taking the power of just being like transparent about how I'm showing up in a conversation and what my intentions are, even to myself, because I think I'm not always transparent with myself. Like I have hidden agendas that I'm not conscious of. Because even at the beginning of this, you said walking in with like, what is it that I want out of this conversation? I'm like, that's an excellent question that I'm not always thinking about. Which no wonder I don't get what I want out of the conversation if I don't even know what it is. Um, cool. Thank you, Chris. It's top of the hour, so we'll wrap up. Thank you everyone for being here. This was awesome. We'll see you again in 2 weeks. Bye.
Bye, everybody.